Hello again everyone, and welcome back. I've returned with another guide, the exceptionally versatile Bleed Bow Gladiator. Eviscerate hordes of enemies with 10 projectile split arrows that swiftly chain between them, inflicting powerful bleeds. Every bleeding enemy will explode on death, annihilating everything nearby with a satisfying bleed pop. Single shots will often spread to multiple packs, easily clean up stragglers, and even off-screen enemies you'll never see. One-shot endgame bosses with a wickedly strong puncture triggered by Assailum's snipe. When fully charged, this single bleed will kill almost anything in seconds, ending most fights with a single brutal strike. Our boss damage doesn't rely on flasks and a bunch of triggered buffs to get the job done. Just simple, consistent, powerful bossing. Defensively, the build has high mobility and can comfortably engage from distance. It pushes a 6 to 7,000+ life pool, strong physical damage reduction, 5 endurance charges, extremely consistent blind, overcapped resistances, a bit of block and dodge, and exceptional life sustain through regen, leech, an automatic enduring cry, and life gain on both stun and kill. With a careful playstyle and strong defensive investment, this is doable in hardcore. The build's gear is almost entirely flexible rares and affordable uniques. Built-in bleed explosions, tons of projectiles, and the power of Assailum allows a modest setup to achieve impressive results, making this decent in solo self-found and a fantastic league starter, with potential to be scaled to impressive heights with continued investment. If you'd like to devastate maps with satisfying bleed pops and one-shot the endgame with supercharged bleeds, I heavily recommend trying this out. This guide uses the Path of Building community fork to summarize its key information. Copy in the pastebin link found below for access to all gem setups, gear sets, and skill trees. I'll be updating the Path of Building link for each new league. All changes will be in the POB notes in the video description. And if you're enjoying the guide, consider subbing to the channel for more in the future. Now let's break down the build's fundamentals and endgame skill tree. We'll be running 2 core skills, both completely focused on inflicting bleed and scaling that bleed damage. Our hits will have a 100% chance to inflict bleeding, a damaging ailment that deals physical damage over time for a set duration. Multiple bleeds can be applied to an enemy at once, but only the strongest bleed will actively deal damage. Bleeding targets that are moving take dramatically increased damage from the bleed. Against bosses, we'll be using Ensnaring Arrow to force this status, ensuring that maximum damage is always being dealt. Split Arrow fires a wide spread of up to 10 arrows that deal 100% physical damage, reliably inflicting a reasonably strong bleed onto everything nearby. Puncture will be used for bossing. It's a single strong projectile that is guaranteed to cause a long bleed that deals up to 49% more damage. When socketed into the Assailum helmet, it becomes a channeled skill, allowing it to be charged up to accumulate stages, up to a maximum of 6. When released, for every stage, Puncture will deal 120% more damage with ailments, a truly monstrous damage increase to our bleeds that allows just a single puncture shot to quickly kill most bosses. In the Path of Building, I'll be including 4 endgame skill trees to fit every budget. Fantastic performance can be achieved on each, starting cheap with no unique jewels, into moderate with unique jewels and small cluster setups, and finally expensive with heavy unique and cluster jewel usage. Offensively, here's the core skill tree I recommend working towards. The offensive notables we'll be picking up, and a quick look at some of the standout inclusions. We wield a bow and use physical projectile-based attacks to inflict bleeds that deal physical damage over time. We're focused on inflicting a single, strong bleed, and don't need to invest heavily into attack speed as a result. We'll be scaling our bleeds with relevant damage over time multipliers, improvements to the speed at which bleeding and damaging ailments inflict damage, and increases to damage over time, as well as other relevant damage types. We aren't critical strike focused, instead sacrificing them completely with the Keystone Resolute technique to guarantee that our attacks will always hit. We'll also be offensively cursing enemies with vulnerability and debuffing them with Ensnaring Arrow. Defensively, here are the notables we'll be allocating and some of the standout inclusions. We'll be scaling large amounts of life across the tree, investing into several endurance charges, heavily scaling armor, getting life leech from this minor node, and overcapping our elemental resistances. This keystone, Wind Dancer, reduces the damage we take if we haven't been hit recently. This comes with little downside, as our evasion is mostly blind-based. This keystone, Call to Arms, makes our Enduring Cry instant, allowing us to use it as our move-only key, ensuring it will be effortlessly activated as often as possible, drastically boosting both life regen and endurance charge generation. Sustaining mana is accomplished mostly through Mana Leech, which we'll be allocating here, with additional support from Cinderswallow's recovery on kill, and possibly from mana cost reductions on our rings or amulet. Jewels that modify our skill trees include Lion's Fall, which converts melee and melee weapon type modifiers in its radius into bow modifiers. In this specific socket, it converts these axe and sword modifiers into bow modifiers we can actually use. The notable cleaving is outside this zone, but that's not an issue as it's still ridiculously good unconverted. Thread of Hope allows us to allocate passives within its ring without pathing directly to them. We'll be placing one with a medium radius directly into this socket to gain access to strong notables that otherwise wouldn't be worth the point investment. Cluster Jewels have a strong place in the higher investment trees of the build. A basic setup will only feature a generic or physical damage over time multiplier medium cluster jewel with a combination of these notables. A more advanced setup will feature a physical or bow damage large cluster jewel with some of these notables, connected to two of the previously discussed medium clusters. You don't need the exact jewels seen here. They may become expensive. Make searches featuring a variety of the notables listed until you find something that fits your budget. For our bandit choice, I recommend siding with either Armour for the 2 passive points, or shockingly with Oak, who offers a decent array of versatile modifiers. Now let's discuss Pantheons. Many of the major gods can serve the build well. I prefer running Lunaris for the consistent movement speed, physical damage reduction, and projectile avoidance. Many of the minor gods are viable as well. I prefer running either Garugon or Rislotha. Now with the basics covered, let's break down our Gladiator Ascendancy. Blood in the Eyes causes our hits to consistently maim enemies and inconsistently blind them, reducing their movement speed and chance to hit heavily. Enemies maimed by us take 10% increased physical damage, a form of more multiplier, and solid boost to our bleed damage. Gratuitous Violence is an offensive monster, providing both 30% increased and a staggering 25% more bleeding damage. On top of that, bleeding enemies we kill will now explode, dealing 10% of their maximum life as physical damage to everything near them, taking our clear speed to an entirely new level. Arena Challenger grants the build access to Challenger charges. These are gained in different ways depending on our current stance. When engaging lots of enemies, we'll consistently be at 10, granting us 20% more attack and movement speed, a powerful gameplay smoothing effect that feels like Deadeye's Tailwind. And finally, we've got Outmatch and Outlast. We'll be wielding a bow, which is considered main hand. As a result, this node only grants frenzy charges on kill. We'll still be generating endurance charges, but from other sources. At maximum frenzy, we'll deal 10% more physical damage, and at maximum endurance, we take 10% reduced physical damage. I recommend picking up your Ascendancies in this order. Now let's talk skill and support gem setups. If available, here are some compelling alternative quality skill gems to consider. Let's begin with our Split Arrow 6-link, socketed into our body armor or bow, whichever is easiest to fully link. Most of our support gems, including Vicious Projectiles, Brutality, Chance to Bleed, and Deadly Ailments, are simply our best in slot increases to bleed damage. Some come with small, mostly irrelevant downsides, such as reduced attack speed, less damage with hits, or the removal of extraneous damage types, but none of this will really impact our bleed damage. The outlier here is Chain Support, which causes our Split Arrow projectiles to bounce off targets they hit on a path towards other nearby enemies, spreading to multiple packs and cleaning up stragglers you'd have to manually kill without it. Budget permitting, most of these gems have awakened versions to consider running. Alternatively, if you're using Lion's Vision, your Split Arrow projectiles will be piercing rather than chaining. Run a setup like this instead, replacing Chain with Swift Affliction, another strong increase to the power of our bleeds. Next, we've got our 4-link Puncture setup, socketed directly into the helmet Assailum. Be sure to maximize Puncture's gem level and quality, as both have a significant impact on our damage output. We'll be running the 3 best support gems for improving bleed damage. Again, consider upgrading to their awakened versions if you have the currency. When socketed into Assailum, Puncture is triggered by the skill Snipe, allowing it to inflict unbelievably strong bleeds. This interaction is fully discussed in the basics section of the guide. If you're having trouble landing your puncture shots, if available, an anomalous puncture will pierce enemies, making it easier to land during chaotic fights at the cost of some damage. I highly recommend running this setup. It's far stronger than a 6-link could ever hope to be, but for some, landing a precise shot or needing to briefly stand still can be deal breakers. If so, here's a non-channeling 6-link puncture setup. This will deal heavily reduced damage, but can be rapidly fired without needing to charge up. Our next setup is an amalgam of 6 gems. This can be placed into our body armor or bow and doesn't need to be 6-linked. First, a 3-link setup. Enduring Cry is a war cry that will be binding as our move only key. As we move, it will be automatically triggered from time to time, regenerating up to a massive 2,000 life over 1 second, and generating endurance charges based on the enemies nearby. Dash is a strong movement skill that can be used to cross gaps, avoid damage, and traverse empty space. Link both to second wind support, which increases the cooldown recovery speed of both skills, and grants dash an additional maximum use. If available, run an anomalous second wind, which grants dash yet another maximum use. Next, another 3-link setup. Cast when damage taken will automatically trigger Immortal Call when we take enough damage to meet its threshold. I recommend keeping it at level 1 so the threshold stays low, ensuring it triggers consistently. Immortal Call's level requirement can't exceed cast when damage taken's, or it won't be triggered. Don't level it past 3. Immortal Call reduces incoming elemental and physical damage heavily for a short time, and will consume all available endurance charges to heavily extend the length and potency of its buff. You can level this setup further if you'd like, but pay close attention to the level requirements. The last socket is flexible. I recommend running Vol Grace, not the aura, just the Vol portion of the skill. When activated, it grants a hefty amount of attack and spell dodge chance for a short time, very helpful during dangerous encounters. Or alternatively, you can expand the Immortal Call setup with increased duration. Next, we've got our 4-link aura setup, socketed into either our gloves or boots. Flesh and Stone is a dual mode aura we can swap at will. It has 2 different stances. In Sand, we take reduced damage from faraway enemies, and nearby enemies will be automatically blinded. In Blood, nearby enemies are automatically maimed and take up to 16% increased physical damage, improving the potency of our bleeds. War Banner is a banner skill that increases the physical damage nearby enemies take. Though it can be manually placed to gain small benefits, I recommend just leaving it as a consistent aura. Malevolence is our most powerful aura, granting up to 20% more damage over time, alongside increased skill effect duration, extending the length of our bleeds. Link all 3 to an enlightened support between levels 2 and 4 that causes linked auras to reserve slightly less mana, leaving more free for skill usage. And finally, we've got our 4-link debuff setup, socketed into our gloves or boots. Ensnaring Arrow is the quiet star of the build. It snares enemies it hits, tethering them to the ground up to 3 times. While ensnared, enemies take increased projectile damage. They'll have dramatically less movement speed, and crucially, are considered to be constantly moving, ensuring that against snared bosses, our bleeds deal their maximum level of damage consistently. We'll be automating Ensnaring Arrow with Ballista Totem, allowing us to place up to 3 totems on the ground that will automatically ensnare nearby enemies for us. Our Ascendancy node Blood in the Eyes causes Ensnaring Arrow to always maim on hit, increasing the physical damage maimed enemies take. The final socket is flexible. I recommend running GMP to help the totems consistently hit their mark. Alternatively, Culling Strike will cause the totems to automatically kill bosses on hit as long as they are below 10% life. Now let's discuss how to best use these skills to map and fight bosses. Here are the keybinds I used. Treat this as a baseline to be modified as you see fit. I heavily advise assigning Enduring Cry to left click, ensuring it will activate as much as possible without ever needing to worry about casting it yourself. When mapping, here are the troublesome map modifiers to keep in mind. Keep your stance locked to Sand. This will keep your Challenger charges maxed out, reduce the damage you take from faraway enemies, and keep nearby enemies blinded. Maintain consistent Flask uptime, and dash frequently to avoid damage, cross gaps, and traverse empty space. If you find yourself in trouble, trigger Vol Grace, gain some distance, and heal up with Enduring Cry and your Life Flask. A single split arrow will typically be enough to hit most nearby enemies and kill them over a short time with the inflicted bleed. Spamming shots isn't necessary to ensure basic kills, but is recommended anytime heavy amounts of enemies are present. Using Puncture while mapping should be avoided, but if necessary, even a partially charged Puncture will be enough to rapidly kill larger threats. Engaging bosses is quite simple. For dangerous encounters, keep your stance in Sand mode. If you're comfortable and want the extra damage, switch over to Blood stance. A few moments before the fight begins, place all 3 Ensnaring Arrow totems near the boss's location. Charge up, do 6 stages of Puncture, and accurately snipe the boss the moment they are susceptible. Immediately after firing, activate Vol Grace and your defensive Flasks. If you landed the shot, your job is likely done. The totems will ensnare the boss, slowing them down and ensuring they take maximum damage. As the boss dies, gain some distance and clear any additional mobs they may spawn. Now let's forge on and discuss how to level the build. The path of building will contain leveling gear sets and skill trees to aid your progression. Let's begin with the skill trees. Here is the early leveling, mid leveling, late leveling, and initial endgame tree. Now for skill gems. Here are the most common ways of obtaining them. I recommend leveling with setups like these. We can start almost immediately with a split arrow and puncture setup. Be sure to utilize an Ensnaring Arrow Ballista Totem setup against bosses. Use dash as your movement skill, and run Enduring Cry as soon as possible. Utilize War Banner early, eventually dropping it for Flesh and Stone and Malevolence when they become available. Add War Banner back into the mix down the line when you're comfortably sustaining mana. And finally, get the cast when damage taken setup going when possible. For the gear, when league starting, run flexible, affordable rare gear in just about every slot. Prioritize maximum life, cap out your elemental resistances, get some movement speed on your boots, and pick up any needed attributes. For players leveling mid-league with currency available, here are some of the best leveling uniques you can run. For everyone, I recommend running flasks like these. Shore up freeze, bleed, and curse immunity early if possible. Now it's finally time to cover the endgame gear. Item prices are at the mercy of supply and demand and will vary over time. These categories will be used to better estimate the future cost of the items discussed. Let's begin with our bow. Your early bows should simply focus on maximizing physical damage. By that, I don't directly mean DPS. We want to inflict single powerful bleeds, even at the cost of attacking slower. Sorting by physical DPS, but capping your attacks per second can help you find cheap, hard-hitting bows. Look for either flexibly priced rares with a focus on these modifiers, or cheap, well-rolled uniques such as Lionized Glare or Crimson Storm. As you accumulate currency, you'll want to work towards our ultimate bow, an Elder-influenced rare with the modifier 60% chance for bleeding inflicted with this weapon to deal 100% more damage, which as it sounds will frequently cause bleeds inflicted by both Split Arrow and Puncture to be drastically stronger. Alongside this central modifier, you'll want strong physical damage, weapon quality, helpful bleed-related modifiers, and attack speed if nothing better is available. For our body armor, the cheap Belly of the Beast is an easy recommendation. It offers a massive amount of percentage increased life, some resistances and armor, and also heavily improves the potency of our life flask. When rolled well, the amount of life on offer is hard to match with even very optimized rares. You can comfortably run this permanently. Alternatively, a rare chest piece can do really good work. Prioritize both flat and percentage increased maximum life, strong armor, and plenty of resistances. Or if you want to maximize Split Arrow's damage potential at the cost of clear speed and usability, the cheap Lionized Vision is a solid choice. For those on a budget, combining your bow or body armor with a cheap Prophecy Jeweler's Touch will net you an instant 5-link. The cheap Tabula Rasa provides a flexible 6-link, but comes with no modifiers. And a search like this will yield a variety of cheap, corrupted 6-links with decent modifiers and the correct socket colors for Split Arrow. Our Quiver will be a flexibly priced rare. A budget example will simply feature great life and resistances. A mid-range example will be similar, but should have either generic or physical damage over time multiplier as well. And an optimized example should feature both generic and physical damage over time multiplier, alongside at least some life. For our helmet, I heavily recommend the cheap and unbelievably strong Assailum, which I discuss in depth in the basics section of the guide. If you decide the channeling nature isn't for you and you're willing to take the massive damage loss, you can run a flexibly priced rare focused on life, resistances, and armor. Here are the best enchantments to look for. This is a very low priority upgrade, as none of these will be widely available on Assailum. Our gloves will be flexibly priced rares. A budget example will have the usual life, armor, and resistances. An optimized example will be similar, but should also feature physical damage over time multiplier. Shocking everyone, our boots will be flexibly priced rares. A budget example should feature strong life, some armor, decent resistances, and of course some movement speed. An optimized example will look quite similar, but should also have the modifier bleeding you inflict deals damage faster. Here are the best boot enchantments to look for. With no truly standout options, any of these can serve you well. Let's continue the rare trend with our flexibly priced Amulet. I recommend using this slot to heavily maximize life, attributes, and any resistances you need. Typically very affordable modifiers that can be easily tuned to fit any budget. When you have a great Amulet secured, look to anoint it. For damage output, choose Growth and Decay. For speed and defensive utility, choose No Witnesses or Crystal Skin. And to scale life, choose Discipline and Training. Our rings will be flexibly priced rares, ideally with a life or resistance base. One should look something like this, focused simply on life, resistances, and needed attributes. If available or craftable, modifiers lowering the cost of non-channeling skills are very helpful for sustaining mana, but are not required. The other will be a bit more expensive and should be held to a lower standard. We want many of the same modifiers, but it should also feature curse enemies with vulnerability on hit. Vulnerability is the perfect curse for the build, causing enemies to take heavily increased physical damage, and bleeds inflicted on them to deal damage much faster. For our belt, I recommend initially running a flexibly priced leather belt or Stygian vise with a ton of life and plenty of resistances. Eventually you'll want to upgrade to the expensive Rislotha's coil. Despite conflicting statements, testing has consistently backed up this belt as a powerful choice for bleed builds. It increases our maximum physical attack damage while lowering our minimum attack damage. This sounds confusing. It goes without saying that you don't want less damage. However, as you might imagine, our maximum attack damage is far larger and has a lot more to gain from a modifier like this than our much lower minimum attack damage has to lose from it. We'll also be trying to min-max the rolls, ideally purchasing or divining a coil with close to 40% more maximum and close to 30% less minimum. A decently rolled example will heavily increase the average damage of our bleeds. If that wasn't enough, the belt also grants a heap of life and added flat physical damage, as well as powerful life gain when we stun enemies, heavily improving our life sustain when engaging many enemies at once. Be sure to quality it with abrasive catalysts to maximize all of its attack modifiers. Our flask selection will feature, first, a cheap Quicksilver flask for increasing movement speed. I recommend looking for one featuring a freeze and chill immunity suffix alongside a flexible prefix. Or if you want to maximize pure speed, look for an extra movement speed suffix alongside a flexible prefix. Second, a cheap Eternal Life flask like this, featuring a bleed immunity suffix alongside a flexible prefix. If you already have bleed immunity elsewhere, a moderately priced, well-rolled Blood of the Karawi offers unmatched recovery. Third, a cheap, well-rolled Rumi's Concoction offers a ton of armor and a high amount of block and spell block chance, an incredible defensive flask. Alternatively, if you still need freeze and chill immunity, get that here on a cheap granite flask alongside a flexible prefix. The final two slots are very flexible. I recommend one of them be a quartz, basalt, or sulfur flask featuring a curse immunity suffix alongside a flexible prefix. I recommend wrapping up with a moderately priced and well-rolled Cinder Swallow, which provides consistent onslaught, a decent veiled modifier, and exceptionally strong life and mana recovery on kill. I recommend looking for either the stun immunity and movement speed, life regeneration, or reduced mana cost. Alternatively, you could run one of the cheap, unused options from our fourth slot, featuring a suffix of increased armor, or immunity to poison, ignite, or shock, alongside a flexible prefix. All that remains now are the jewels. We'll be making use of a cheap Lionized Fall, moderately priced Thread of Hope, and potentially some expensive cluster jewels. Each of these I discussed in detail in the basics section of the guide. In spare sockets, we'll be placing flexibly priced rare jewels. Look for life, beneficial offensive modifiers, and resistances or attributes you may be lacking. And finally, for those on a high budget, I highly recommend running a Watcher's Eye, featuring one of these Malevolence modifiers. Both provide a powerful boost to our bleeds. And that's just about everything. I hope the guide serves you incredibly well. A huge thank you to all of my patrons for their continued support. Producing this content wouldn't be possible without them. Recognition goes to Adam Benamias, Agent Leo, Andrew Miller, Benjamin Grant, Bloody, Chris IRL, Christopher Cravey, Daniel Wig, Darren Clark, David Kanzu, Gareth Thomas, Garth Anderson, Greg Spanko, Greg Wells, Hunter Wild, It's Mr. Worm to You Gaming, Jacob Davey, John Snyder, Kevin Griffin, Kevin Langevin, Kurt Wood, Lukash Galik, Marley, Matt Cardenas, Michael Johnson, Mick Woodney, Mike Anubis Gaming, Modimus Prime, Nate, Piotr, Rasmus Blockposko, Ray Hill, Richard Bollinger, Ryan McDonald, Sabaton Babylon, Spencer Ripe, Tony G, 773, Varos Vitele, Vincent Foss, William Dean, Wyatt Sabled, and finally, Xi. Thank you so much, everyone. I truly appreciate it. An additional thank you to Modimus Prime, Nate, and Michael Johnson for their extra support. If you'd like to receive a credit or join our Discord for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link below. If you enjoyed the video and appreciate the work I put into it, consider liking the video and subbing to the channel for more upcoming guides. And as always, I've been Esro, and I will see you guys in the next video.